Hi, it's Andrew from Acuity AutoRedact. Welcome to the Data Protection Weekly podcast, where we wrap up all the biggest issues affecting data protection professionals in the UK each week. So one of the privileges of doing what I do is that I get to work with data protection officers very closely and often get to hear some of the fears and anxieties that they have, particularly around the entire DSAR process. And it's always really interesting because it always comes at the end of the process. They hand the DSAR over to the subject and then think, okay, I really hope at this point that this DSAR isn't going to be challenged, that the subject's not going to turn around and say, oh, actually, I don't understand why you redacted this, and I think you've been overzealous with your redactions, and I'm going to complain to you, and if I'm not happy, I might even go to the Information Commissioner's Office. And it's always that fear that data protection officers have. Often not realised. It's actually really in the minority of cases you hear about complaints, but it's always that fear that you hear. So I thought we'd use this episode and our time together to discuss, maybe some strategies we can implement with our DSAR processes that can mitigate that, or at least if it does happen and there is a complaint, because we can't control that obviously as data protection professionals, maybe we can make it easier to process by being a bit proactive and thinking of some ways. So I thought, okay, let's spend this episode, let's discuss 5 ways in which we might make sure that the DSAR process we undertake is more defended, more resistant to challenges. So that's what I thought we could discuss today. So one technique that I've, and I should point out, these things are things that I've completely stolen from talking to other data protection officers, but they're good advice. It's good advice nonetheless. So the first technique that I've heard is some data protection officers add a narrative cover letter with the DSAR that they return. And it doesn't have to be very long. It just goes through and says why they redacted everything. And I thought this was actually quite a simple method, but actually quite a powerful one. Just to summarize, we've made these redactions. This is why we've done it. What were the justifications for it? Just putting that little cover letter at the front, not the usual one that, people get that says, hi, here's your DSAR. I hope you're happy with it. Or, there you go. We've processed your request on time. But just a little narrative, and it's usually very similar, that we have to remove information about certain subjects, who were third parties, who weren't relevant to the DSAR, and some of the information was just out of context, company information, completely out of scope of the original request. So we have to redact large sections of that. And that's quite powerful. And I think if you put yourself in the minds of the subject, they will have a reason they want that information. They will want that information for a particular reason. And that little bit of a justification or narrative letter gives them a bit of respect. It says, look, I've processed your request. I've done it as you've asked me to. I've done what you've requested. But also, I couldn't give you everything, but here's why. And, I hope you understand the context and that you can work with us together. And from talking to DPOs, the ones that have started doing this are less likely to even receive a challenge in the first place. I think it's a combination of things. I think it's firstly a little bit of a feeling that the subject feels respected, that they feel like someone's taken the time to put that additional letter together, but also that they can go, oh, okay, yeah, I can see why this was redacted. I don't need to challenge it. So it serves a dual purpose. It's a nice idea. The other one that can be quite useful is redacting by context and event, not just by picking individual pieces of information. So sometimes removing an entire contextual event from a data subject access request return can really show that you've taken the time to remove something where there's lots of people who are personally identifiable, or things or events which are outside of scope and it's been completely removed. It doesn't do that thing where subject names are removed and the person's trying to piece together and doesn't really understand what's happening and thinks maybe is something being covered up with these names, what's going on, who was being referred to, was that me that was being referred to in this story? But if it's completely out of scope, it can be removed. And this feature was really powerful, actually, when we were developing our winter release of Acuity AutoRedact in late 2025. A data protection officer actually asked us, could we put in a feature where our tool summarizes all the events throughout documents and you can tick them completely? So because essentially their clients were getting quite a few complaints saying there's all these like half redacted events and it's actually causing a bit of anxiety with the subjects that they were returning it to. And that was really interesting. But actually removing the entire event made people less anxious, less likely to challenge, because it was just obvious that entire paragraphs were outside of scope of the request and people weren't turning around to say what's in the entire paragraph. But when there were disjointed sentences, little bits were taken out just to remove personally identifiable names. It caused more anxiety. So that's one thing that can be done. The other third thing that I think is quite useful and that I've seen data protection officers use quite well is to actually use legal privilege and management forecasts as exemption categories correctly. So a lot of DSAR requests end up with almost every redaction being it's third-party personal information. It can't be in there. It's third-party personal information. But actually making it really clear that if you are redacting things and it has to do with management predictions or privileged legal information that can't be disclosed beyond, and that's really signposted clearly as reasons for redaction, it's quite hard to challenge that. You can actually see there's a very specific reason why some information is removed. So, using clear categories like that to say this is why we have redacted the information, that can make subjects feel a bit more at ease. And it's just something that could go along with the report. So in terms of how it could look, it could just be, for example, you write an entire section is unfortunately legally privileged information, or, for example, contains a business forecast or an organizational forecast that's outside of the scope of the request, and it isn't relevant to the request that's being taken place. So just being really transparent with categories. Once, some DSARs you read and everything's redacted because of third-party personal information, but actually using different categories to justify the reasons for redaction and using them properly can really give the subject a lot of confidence that, there's actually multiple reasons why different things have been redacted. It's been a really thorough job that's been done here. I don't need to challenge it. It's clearly been done correctly. Whereas if you just say everything was removed because of third-party personal information, that might be true. If it is, obviously don't lie. Don't make up categories and say I've redacted because it's management projections and legally privileged information. But if that is the case, use them properly. Use the categories that are available to redact comprehensively. Use the range of them where appropriate, and it gives the confidence that the redaction has been done properly. So that's just one to think about. The other thing which can give a lot of confidence is trying to avoid, so my fourth tip would be trying to avoid over redaction. So for example, if a paragraph contains a mix of the requester's data and somebody else's, try to only redact the identifier while leaving the sentiment of what happened intact. So for example, you don't need to sometimes just remove whole sections if it is in the context of the document likely to be about the person. You could actually say, in this case, I'm going to be quite tactical and just remove the bits that are third-party personal information. Now, you might say, actually, Andrew, isn't that a bit of a contradiction? Because your second one, bit of advice, said, actually, look if you need to remove entire bits of context. Well, yes, if it's out of scope, removing entire bits of context, entire events, that's useful because it shows that confidence that the entire thing's out of scope. But actually, if it is within scope, you can go, actually, I'm just going to remove the bits that identify people that are there, that actually, in this case, the majority of the material can be given to the subject. Just the personally identifiable bits for third party need to be removed. So there's a professional judgment there. When is it important to remove an entire section? When is it important to just remove individual names from an event that they know is on file and that they know about and that they have a right to see what's being recorded about them, but perhaps the third party information needs to be removed. So it's using that professional judgment, isn't it? But actually, sometimes not going overboard and over restricting can give the confidence to the subject that you have redacted this appropriately, and that if you go overboard and redact lots and lots and lots, it can sometimes give not much confidence in the redaction process. And my final tip, tip 5, which I've found to be the most powerful when I've been talking to DPOs, is instead of just redacting in black or white, color code the redactions. So, for example, out of all the categories that you can redact information for example, thinking if it's privileged legal information, or if it has to do with crime and taxation information that's outside of scope, or if it is third-party personally identifiable information, you can color code the reason for the redaction. So every redaction for one reason's in blue, for another's in red, for another it's in orange. And then you can provide a color-coded key at the start to explain the reasons why each piece of data has been redacted. Now, that's a feature that was so powerful when a DPO told me about it that we actually baked that into Acuity AutoRedact as our tool. So we made absolutely sure that when people redact, there's a color-coded button they can tick. And if they tick that button, it will color code why the information was redacted. The AI comes up with the reasons based on reading the data, but the user can change them if they wish to. If they wish to show a range of information and reasons why things have been redacted, that's something they can also manually build upon the work that the AI does, but the AI does the majority of it. And then when the report goes to the subject, it actually color codes why every redaction took place, which can give a lot of confidence in the process. So I'd say that's my top tip. If somebody opens it and goes, well, why is page 12 redacted? Well, they can see, it's in red. Red's the color I'm using for privileged legal information that I can't know about. Okay, it's been explained through a color-coded key, and it's really intuitive. So that works really well. So just to kind of summarize the reasons the methods that we can use to really, really help reduce people feeling that they need to challenge a DSAR. Firstly, do a custom narrative cover letter with every DSAR that gets sent back. You spend a lot of time making it as good as possible. Why not give a narrative to explain how you redacted the information? If you do that, people are going to have confidence, not going to challenge. Secondly, have the confidence to remove large sections if they are outside of scope. Obviously, justify why you've done it. Maybe you could use multiple bits of these methods. You could use the color-coded key as well as just redacting it out of scope. But if it's completely out of scope and the event needs to be fully removed and the whole context around it, that can be removed, but you can give a little justification. Whereas sometimes where there's like little bits that you can see and piece together, that can make people a bit suspicious if there's something being hidden. So that's something to exercise professional judgment on. The next one is to use all the reasons you can use to redact data. Mention that it has to do with, maybe an ongoing crime investigation, if that's relevant, or if it's third-party personal information that, you don't want to disclose, if it's legally privileged information. Showing that you've used a range of categories to redact information gives people the confidence that it's being done properly, and sharing the reasons for redaction also gives that confidence. So do it. Don't just say everything's third-party personal information and it's being stripped out, because that, perhaps makes people think, well, is that the only reason data is being redacted? Maybe there's other reasons we need to look at. Maybe something's been covered up. Sure, it's not, but that would give confidence that you are confident to use a range of reasons for redaction. It shows that there's a thorough process. The next bit of advice was a little bit in contradiction to the second. Use the least restrictive approach. If it's obvious what's going on in the event and the subject needs to know about it, only redact the little bits that you need to. If they have a right to know about that, make sure that they see it on display and it's visible. That gives confidence in the process, and it is your responsibility above all else as a data protection professional to do that. And then my last tip was, don't just redact in black and white, redact in a color-coded key, and give the subject the key so that they know why everything's being redacted. So give every reason a color and then redact against that color. And as I've said, Acuity AutoRedact has that baked in. So if you use that as your redaction engine, it'll do that straight out of the box. Cool. Okay. Well, it's been, as I hope becomes a regular thing, a really, really enjoyable experience to record this and share it with you. I'm sure people in the data protection sphere will have comments and feedback. So please comment, like, subscribe to the podcast. It'd be great to hear all your thoughts. And again, if you are thinking, well, how can I speed up my redactions of DSARs? I'd also run a service called Acuity AutoRedact. I've mentioned it a few times in the podcast. You can just Google Acuity AutoRedact and will come straight up. And that's a tool you can put in as many documents as you like into it, and it automatically redacts it using really sophisticated AI. Everything after it's uploaded is destroyed from the system, so it's not used to do anything like train models or be used for any other purpose. It is just destroyed as soon as it's uploaded, and it makes the redaction process much, much easier. As I said, it color codes the reasons for redaction as well. So have a look at it if you get a chance, but if not, I look forward to speaking to you again next week on the Data Protection Weekly podcast, and thank you for tuning in.
Data Protection Weekly.